Previously, in the playlist link below the like button, so previous videos, we've set up one-to-one relationships. Now we are going to be dealing with one-to-many relationships. So the next thing that we're going to do is set up our department. This is kind of a continuation of our notes. So in our department, this is our next relationship, and we're making it between the employees and department. Now, one-to-many, a department can have many employees, but an employee can only belong to a single department. That's how we're setting it up. So inside of our department, we're replacing some of our code here. It's still an entity, of course. It's public class department. We have our ID and an @generated value, and the generation type is .identification, or really it's .identity here. We want to change the integer that we previously had to a long, and we're calling it department ID, so we don't get it confused with our employee, which is just long ID. So inside of our department, we have private long department ID, we have our string name, and we have our string location. And then we are going to want to have a set of employees, because many employees can belong to this department. So we're going to have a one-to-many relationship. It's mapped by our department. And then we have fetch is equal to fetch type lazy. That means we only call this whenever we call it. We only instantiate this, put things into our getters and setters when we call this. It's not done automatically. We have our cascade to all, and we have our private set employee, and then we have our employees right here. So we have a set of employees, and it's called employees. We have our standard constructor. We have a parameterized constructor only with name and location, because our ID is auto-generated, and this is going to be filled up for us. We have our get ID, set ID, get name, set name, get location, set location. And then lastly, we have an override method where we're just having a toString right here. Next, we need to be inside of our employee to relate this. So inside of our employee, we need to know how to do our one-to-many. Now, there are going to be some terms which we can go over, and that will be done in a second. So we know we have our ID generated value, private long ID. It's of course still an entity. We have our first name, last name. We're changing, I think this was like occupation or something. We're changing that to role. So we'll have to change that in our code later as well. Next, we have our one-to-one. And this is mapping our one-to-one to the employee contact info. And we've previously gone over that. Next, we have a many-to-one. Inside of our many-to-one, our fetch type is set equal to lazy, so it's a little bit different than one-to-one. But fetch is equal to fetch type.lazy. Option is false because our employee needs to have a department. We have this @join column, and this join column is important because we are joining our employee column with our department column based on our department ID. So name is equal to department ID. So that means it's going to join based on what we have auto-generated right here. So based on that, we'll join, and our nullable is equal to false. Now we have private department, and it's called department. So this is what we're going to have stored here. And this is just making an instance of our department here. A variable, it's a field now. We have our public employee. This is a default constructor. We have a parameterized constructor only for first, last name, role, and salary. Get ID, set ID, get first name, set first name, get last name, set last name, get role, set role, get salary, set salary, and these are just standard. Make sure your double isn't uppercase double though, so it can accept nulls. We have our get contact info, we have our set contact info. We've previously talked about this, but we can go over again because it's pretty cool. For the contact info, we don't want it to be null, right? So we have this employee contact info passed in. We're saying if the contact info that's passed in is set equal to null, then this .contact info is not null, and this .contact info is the null for this employee, not the one that's passed in. This one passed in is the different from what we're dealing with the employee right now. So the one that's passed in is equal to null, and if our current one is not null, then we want to set our employee to null. So we have this .contact info .set employee, and we set it to null. Otherwise, our contact info .set employee to this, so we're going to set it to what we have, and then we have this .contact info is set equal to our current contact info. So So no matter what, at the end, it's going to be set equal to this contact info. We have our public department get department, we have our set department, and we have our override. So the only thing kind of tricky about it is the set contact info right here. But really, I believe what's happening is that if the contact info is null, so the one that's passed in is null, then we want to see if the current contact info for our employee is not null. And if it's not null, then this, meaning the contact info that's related to this employee, dot contact info, dot set employee, should be null. Because if the one that's passed in is null and our current one is not null, this should be null. Our employee should be null. Otherwise, our employee should be set to this. And then we have this dot contact info. So this last part is going to run no matter what. The this dot contact info is set to whatever contact info we have here. So this is just a check. Now let's go into our app.java. Inside of our app.java, we're going to test our app. Before we do that though, actually let's go back to our employee and let's go over some terms to deal with this. The terms we have are the fact that there's an owning side of the relationship and a referencing side of the relationship. Now the many side is typically the owning side. This is a side which has a foreign key referencing to the other. We want each employee to reference a department in the department table foreign key. This cannot be null, so that's why we have nullable is equal to false, because an employee must have a department. So that is how we would go about this here. And to enable this, we're going to use our join column annotation. And then we have getters and setters for our department, which I just showed. So now back in our application, we can run this. This part is just instantiating everything, just making our factory. Entity manager factory is equal to persist.create entity manager factory. And you pass in our XML file, which is our persistent XML. It's going to look something like this. We have our properties, we have our persistent unit name, and we have our class package, we have our properties, and then we're going to end this. Back in our app, we want to have a try catch, so we can try to do this. We have our get transaction begin. We want to try to create our departments, so we have tech and research, floor 3 and 7. We're going to try to create our employees. We have EC1, ECI2, ECI3. Then we create our employees. Actually, this is employee contact info, and this one's employees. So now all that's done, we have to relate them together. We have our first employee.setContactInfo, and we set it to ECI1, and then we do the same thing for the others. Now we do this for our departments. So we have the tech department, research department, and research department for first, second, and third employee. We have our entity manager, where we persist this, and we persist our departments. Entity manager persist, we persist our employees, and then entity manager persist, where we're going to persist our contact info, so that we can save all these to our database. Now previously we've printed out a list for our employees and our contact details. Now we're going to do the same for details. So for details, we have a list of type department. We're going to call it department info, and we just have a create query right here. And we're going to search through our query, this is our query. We're going to search through our table. And we have select DEP from department DEP. The DEP is just renaming this, it's an alias. And then we get the result, store in department info, and then we have a for each loop that runs through it to print it out. So if we wanted to, we can run this and see what we got. Running this, we get our notes up top right there. We'll go through this a little bit. And then we have our alter table employee. We have our alter table employee contact info, and then we have our drop tables. So we're going to drop these. They're alternating, or these are altering, I believe, because of the foreign key as well. We have our create table department. We have our create table employee. We have our create table employee contact info. Notice how our ID is not null, and the department ID is not null, and it's set to auto increment. Then we have our other create tables. We have our alter table. We have our alter table where we add the constraint, and it's a foreign key. It references department ID. And then this references our, because this is employee contact info that we've gone over previously, the foreign key is employee ID, and it references the ID from employee. Then we have our insert statements, our select and our update statements. After these is where we're going to print. So we've gone over this previously. We have our employees printing out, or the employee contact info, and then we have our employees with the employee contact info, and then lastly, we have our departments. And so if we go to our MySQL database, we can see that we have a select star from employee. If we run this, we're going to have all of our employees listed right here. And we see the department ID. Now, and this is because it's joined. Let's look at our employee contact info. Still looks good. Let's look at employee details. I don't think there's anything here because we didn't do anything with it. Let's look at employee entry. Nothing here because we didn't do anything with it, but there should be something for department. And we can see that we have our two departments here, 1 and 2, for our tech and research departments. And if we go back to our show create tables, instead of selecting from our tables, we can open this and we can see that we have exactly what we had in our console. So that is how we would verify and model one-to-many relationships. In the next video, we're going to be looking at modeling many-to-many relationships.